Hello, this is Creative Democracy, Designing Hip Hop. Welcome, guys. My name is Adrian Franks. Just want to kind of walk you guys through a deck that I created a while ago. I made some updates too, but it really talks about this idea of how, designing hip hop or the design of hip hop. Something that was serendipity, but has some intentional aspects to it. Just want to kind of walk you guys through that today and, celebrate this 50th, 50th year of hip hop being, around, right? It's kind of cool that we can even have these kind of milestones. And I figured as a designer myself, I would just kind of walk you guys through some thinkings around it, specifically around the album covers. But even before we get to the album covers, we're going to just talk and give some context and insights about hip hop itself. Just to kind of give you an overview of who I am, my name is Adrian Franks. Most people call me AD. I've been a creative pro now for the last 27 plus years. 20 of those years mostly in digital, of everything design. First in the nation to be awarded the graphic design journeyman. I also worked at a bunch of different companies, basically doing everything from experience design to campaigns to, overall branding. And yes, I still want to be an astronaut. So, one of my favorite things I like to say is stay hungry, stay curious, and work hard. So first, let's talk about design. Design. What is design? Well, design is the art and practice of planning and projecting ideas and experiences with visual and textual content. So if you start thinking about design, here you can start seeing a couple of different things like planning, projecting, ideas, experience, visual, textual content. And then you can almost start looking at it in a weird kind of, call out, right? So like the planning and projecting is more the actions, the ideas and the experiences is the why and the what. And the tangible is the visuals and the textual content. Now, you can put it into like a creative formula, the why plus the what plus the action plus the tangible can equal a very unique transformative experience. But what does it really do, right? Well, design at its core should solve problems. But for who? Well, it solves problems, well, for us, the human species. And not just us as, the humans, but, it solves problems for our environment. It could solve problems for, even non-humans, right? That's going to be like trees, vegetation, animals, environmental things that we all live in. But ultimately, it's here to solve problems for us as a species. This idea of humans, especially not just one type of human, but all humans. Now, what is creativity? The use of imagination or original ideas. And keep in mind, that's nothing really new under the sun. But, for lack of better words, we're going to kind of use this format here to kind of tell a story, right? So, it usually starts like this, right? Ideas can begin as I have an idea. Now, normally you start kind of telling people about what the ideal is. Some people may say, let's make it better. I want to hear more of it, right? You start getting some feedback. Some may say your idea is whack. Some may say it's lit. But ultimately, that feedback can lead to a better idea, right? So in the end of the day, once you start having ideas, sharing those ideas, getting feedback, you have a better idea. Now, let's see how this plays out as an example in, when it comes to design and creativity, specifically, again, around hip hop. What I'm calling the creative cultural social movement, because it wasn't just one person doing this or created hip hop per se. But it did kind of start, an idea has to start with somewhere, right? It can start with a person. But, for lack of argument, we're going to say that hip hop probably started with this guy. And not necessarily just him, but metaphorically speaking, some would call this person that you see DJing the godfather of hip hop. And he go by the name of DJ Kool Herc. Now, not just Kool Herc was doing certain things back in the 70s in the clubs when he was kind of like taking the break of a beat, which is usually like the transitional part of a song going from one movement to another, and kind of spinning it where you could continuously dance against that part of the song. He basically wasn't the only one doing that, but he had an idea, right? Like, hey, let's take what we're doing in the clubs in terms of like taking these beats and, people dancing against the beats and looping the beat, and he wanted to take it out to the people. And now that idea went from the club to plugging the actual turntables into telephone poles at your local parks, right? this is when he started inviting others in on the idea, right? Like, hey, we got this idea that was kind of, amongst ourselves. Now we're sharing it with everybody, and the idea just kind of grew, right? And then feedback came from the community. Some people say it was fresh. Some people say that's hype. Some people say let's make it better. And that's kind of how people talk back then. But nonetheless, feedback came from the community, and from that community, certain roles were taken. The breaker gave it moves, the writer gave it visuals, the MC, the ubiquitous MC, gave it a voice, right? So again, this idea of hip hop starting from a DJ slash producer really allowed for these different roles to be taken, and it grew the community, and it turned into like what I'm calling a disruptive cultural network, right? Hip hop is more than an idea now. It's this beautiful, like, network of just culture just permeated the entire planet. Now, early hip hop design elements and tools. Let's kind of talk about that for a moment. So I'm just gonna call this part like the cipher, right? Like, most people in hip hop, this is kind of lingo that we talk. Like a cipher is like a circle of like-minded individuals, where it's actually performing or creating or debating or whatever. But a cipher, you could say the early cipher for hip hop would probably be the DJ, the MC, the breaker, the writer, right? And at some point in that cipher, in the middle of it came the fans, because the fans are just, people who just wanted to just be a part of the culture. It wasn't necessarily people who created it, right? Now, coming from the fans, you start having other types of jobs per se, or, industries that kind of built up even, around the fans and the actual, the original cipher, right? When you start having journalists, visual artists, photographers, label owners, designers, and directors, now basically, making the culture even better, right? Making it a little bit more accessible, right? Especially if they're telling stories in, like, news articles, or, the artists are like creating art, or photographers are kind of capturing and documenting these moments, and even designers are designing beautiful clothing, right? And even the directors kind of creating like stories around the culture of hip hop, right? And even the label owners who allow a lot of these guys to more or less change their lives, or some say ruin it, but depends on how you want to look at it, right? But nonetheless, that cipher grew from a 4 to now what you see, this current cipher. Now, let's start by talking about, a designer, right? Dapper Dan. I would say he's like the original guy. Took a lot of like clothing from different fashion boutiques, and he customized it really for a lot of the guys in the early rappers, because let's be honest, a lot of these brands didn't really necessarily wanted rappers, African Americans, wearing their clothing, especially African Americans and Puerto Ricans, people, the culture that actually created hip hop. Dap actually thought it'd be a cool idea to just create garments that hip hop guys could wear, right? Specifically printing some of these labels and their iconic kind of patterns onto like garments and clothing that these guys can wear, right? So you got everything from like LL Cool J to like, Diddy, definitely like Salt and Pepper, ASAP Ferg. I mean, literally all the rappers from then up until now, they're now using Dapper Dan's designs in a lot of their gear. And the beautiful thing about that is that, all the things Dap went through, regardless of hardships in terms of getting shut down by the brands, and now he's had a resurgence with Gucci. Like, it's a beautiful thing. And it's because of his innovative thinking around fashion and like repurposing a lot of this material for fashion design, and specifically around hip hop. It allowed for this originality to permeate in the culture. One would probably say that he's probably the first fashion designer in hip hop, right? Let's talk about Jamil Shabazz. With any movement, it's always going to have a person who can capture this visually. I think he's done a phenomenal job capturing the visuals of hip hop, specifically through photography. Jamil has done a lot in terms of shooting, people's styles, kind of shooting people's dispositions, kind of just shooting random people on the streets from, early 80s up until now. But I think the thing about his photography, what it does is, and I guess at the time he wasn't even realizing that he was archiving real life movement through the art of photography. And, keep in mind, this is when photography was like on film, and film is very expensive. Even knowing what to shoot, because you just can't let off a lot of shots with a film camera like you can with like a digital camera of today's world. So he had to be very mindful of what he was going to shoot and when moment to kind of capture upon shooting this. And these moments, obviously, it was like a moment in time. He caught things as they was being developed. And, now we got this rich history, hip hop, from different aspects of the culture. So we're going to move on to what I'm calling the labels, right? Some of the first labels of hip hop, like one, more so the label owners, one being Sylvia Robinson and obviously the two guys that helped started Def Jam. So, from those two labels came the Sugar Hill Gang, specifically from Sylvia Robinson's label. Think about it, that she actually would be considered the first organized hip hop label, first hip hop label in hip hop. So kudos to her. And she basically put together this crew called the Sugar Hill Gang, And then from Def Jam, you get the guys that I love the most is Run DMC. Arguably at the time, probably one of the biggest hip hop groups at the moment. Definitely the most pioneering even to this day. Much respect to DMC, DJ Run, and RIP to our brother Jam Master Jay. Now, you look at this next slide is basically a few things here, right? You see color, you see typography, you see a lot of styling, you see, all those elements on either a wall or the side of a train. But ultimately, this is like our first iteration of visual arts within hip hop. It was called graffiti. And true enough, humans been writing on walls since the dawn of man. But to have a specific style, this particular artist did this. I mean, that's what graffiti allowed to have. It allowed for these visual artists to communicate who they were while staying anonymous at the time. And then it allowed to make these big, bold statements using typography, using aerosol cans, because, hey, listen, a lot of these guys can afford oil paints. Oil paints are very expensive. But aerosol cans at the time, pretty democratic and pretty cheap. Well, one graffiti artist that came out of that movement is Jean-Michel Basquiat. Started out as a graffiti artist. He obviously did a bunch of different things. He played music. He was in a band. He wrote poetry. But, him being a graffiti artist first and writing on walls allowed him to really explore his creative side. Mind you, the guy had been drawing since he was a kid. He had been an artist a pretty long time, and his parents supported a lot of his creative endeavors. But, from hip hop was birthed Jean-Michel Basquiat. And now, a good friend of his was this guy by the name of Fab Five Freddy, another graffiti artist. These guys hung out together. They was best of friends. Some of the early pioneers of hip hop when it comes to the visual arts. But Fab Five will also go on to do something pretty big, not just visual artist, but he also got into being a TV host, specifically around Yo MTV Raps, right? This is MTV's take on hip hop as a culture through music videos on the network, which is ironic because, MTV started out as a rock and roll network and wouldn't even play a lot of the music coming from African-American artists and Latin brown artists and even any other artist that wasn't a rock and roll artist. With Michael Jackson happened to break down those barriers through CBS. Now you get years later after the network started, they created a platform for Yo MTV Raps. I just remember that, Yo MTV Raps was that thing that we all would rush home to kind of watch, especially if you had cable, right? Or somebody would tape it and we would just watch like all the different hip hop acts that would totally be on that show. So, kudos to Brother Fab Five Freddy for innovating Yo MTV Raps. Now, if you're going to talk about hip hop, there's no way you can't talk about kicks. And if you talk about some of the most famous kicks, the Jordan brand that came out of Nike in the mid-early 80s. This silhouette obviously is probably one of the most famous sneakers probably on the planet for a couple of different reasons. One is actually named after the actual athlete, Michael Jordan, upon signing with Nike in the 80s when he went into the NBA. But it wasn't just Jordan that made that sneaker famous, right? And if you think about, the commercials around the early Jordan sneaker brand, it brought in a whole nother character. I think probably for the first time where you now start seeing a character from a film being used in advertising to help tell the story of a sneaker. And that character in the middle would be Mars Blackman, character played by none other than Spike Lee from his movie, She's Gotta Have It. Now, if you think about like Mars Blackman was a character, maybe one would consider him the first sneakerhead. Funny throughout the entire film of She's Gotta Have It, Mars never took his sneakers off. He wore the Jordan. I remember Spike saying that he was chosen by the guys at White and Kennedy to actually produce the commercials for this new brand, right? For Jordan's new sneaker. And the person who really chose Spike was Jordan himself, partly because Spike wore the sneakers in his film. So it's kind of like literally just being a fan himself of the shoe allowed Spike to even take his character that he created for his film and use that to kickstart off his career in advertising and telling stories with brands. Now, let's talk about publications. So you look at this early cover for Right On, they kind of use like a what they call like a Rebus or a circus design, where it's like design is kind of all over the place, whereas big copy at the top, you got some, left justified headline or big copy to the left, and you know, you got these silhouetted imagery of the different guys from like Big Daddy Kane to Guy to EPMD to Kumo D to the DOC, all kind of arranged in like this multi-panel Revis approach. But that was kind of like the design for the early days of hip hop magazines and publications. Probably because they want to sell a lot without, losing a lot of the real estate on the cover. That approach worked for Word Up. Same kind of design, right? Is a little busy, fairly busy. Different types, styles, different fonts, different designs, a lot of photos. But for the most, that worked, right? It caught your attention. It was trying to showcase a lot of artists who was like up and coming at the time, and it really did its job. Now, along come another publication called The Source, which took a whole nother approach. It basically decided that we're going to feature one artist at a time. We're not going to show all the artists. We're going to maybe approach this kind of the same manner as like the Rolling Stone mag or any of those other rock magazines. And we're going to make it where we're going to have the main story have a focus on one artist at a time. And The Source, obviously went on to become like part of the culture in many different ways with the 5 mics, the unsigned hype section of The Source, even like the main story that was being featured in The Source. It was like, a way that they covered hip hop. It became rock star status, right? Now, within The Source, this guy by the name of Andre Leroy Davis, one of my idols, to be honest with you, he illustrated a lot of the things at the end, specifically like recapping who was on the cover through illustrations, right? Like I got a chance to really meet this guy on the first move to New York. And it was great to meet my own idol, somebody who was a pivotal part of like telling these visual stories in publications that was, more or less ran by the culture. I kind of gave some context on everything specifically around like hip hop. Let's kind of get into what I want to talk about today. It's the cover arts, because obviously cover art is that thing. It's a part of the experience. It's not just there to help sell a record, but it's going to do that too. But it's there to communicate ideas. And if you think about cover art from in the past, right, it was, cover art ranged from seeing things on like tapes, definitely like vinyl records. But the cool thing about like cover art, right, it really helped to tell a story of, visually of what you were going to kind of get into before you even heard the first song. Now, this is prior to when blockbusters allow you to like listen to music before you purchase. You have to just kind of trust the artist, right? You have to like, okay, here's the art, here's the record cover, here's the actual product. Maybe what I'm going to see is going to kind of give me a preview onto what's going to happen, what kind of story is going to be told, or what I'm going to be listening to. But nonetheless, cover art had to be very unique. It had to stand out. It had to more or less break through a lot of noise, whether it's going to be in the form of a tape or a CD or like actual vinyl records. So if you think about cover art from the 80s, early hip hop cover art really was mimicking things from the 70s, right, or the prior generation. So you think about it, right? Everything from like Run DMC to Sugar Hill Gang to Grandmaster Flash, all the way down to Salt and Pepper. They were just really mimicking a lot of the design and art direction from prior artists themselves. So in the case of like Sugar Hill Gang, that's in the middle, like that almost feels like some kind of like like a funk slash R&B kind of whimsical album cover. I almost feel like the Wits. We get to Grandmaster Flash, Miller Mill, and the Furious Five, totally borrowing from like Funkadelic. Like that is 100 inspired by George Clinton and those guys. Then you look at the Beastie Boys in the middle. That's like anything from like Pink Floyd to Aerosmith to just straight up pure rock, right? In terms of those covers, like some of the best album covers that I love, ironically came from, rock. You got Salt and Pepper, you got their cover, which is more or less kind of, want to show the artist, right? And I just like, the Furious Five above them, you kind of have to show the artist. The same thing with Run DMC. And with Salt and Pepper, kind of got like a R&B feel, right? You got these three individuals, two MCs and a DJ, and you kind of have to show the artist. And then with Run DMC, they profess themselves to be the king of rock. And, what's a better way to do that? Through repetition of words, right? Using typography and simple imagery to kind of show like this beautiful cover. Cover's going late 80s, early 90s, depending on how you want to look at it. But more or less, these were covers, that I thought was phenomenal from the 90s. Now, the style does change. It goes from the previous era to something that's a little bit more contemporary at the time. You have a Notorious B.I.G. cover with a very simple white background with a kid on a big afro, right? You got Muhammad D at the bottom left with this ideal of showing this militant, powerful sister with the big afro, the big hoop rings, and she got like this forceful red energy around her. Right in the middle, you got De La Soul. Their cover feels very whimsical, very hippie, very reminiscent of like the Beatles, right? So yeah, you take that. This is definitely like feel like something that the Beatles could have easily created. But thinking about De La Soul, these guys were just originators of just originality in hip hop at the moment. You got the Fugees at the top right, where you now have the score, which more or less feels like a borrowing from the actual movie The Godfather, especially the typography side. It feels like something cinematic. And then you got Raekwon at the bottom right with his whole, cinematic approach to album cover with him and Ghostface. Covers from the 2000s. This is where you have the cover and the design now starts taking a little bit more of a turn, right? Especially when it comes to art direction. Budgets are a little bit bigger. Design resources are a little bit more in abundance. Options are a little bit more easier to pull from in terms of talent. And even, the advent of like computers really help to, make these covers a little bit more visceral. You take the G Unit cover at the top left. I mean, it's almost feel like something out of like a magazine kind of cover, almost like a fashion magazine. And if you kind of look at it, well, they're kind of selling something. It feel like an ad, right? It feel like, hey, 50 Cent and the two brothers behind them. So these guys are basically, essentially selling hip hop on that level, their version of hip hop, right? Which is opulence, certain sense of edge, and a certain sense of like just style, And then you got Jay-Z's Magna Carta Holy Grail. It's funny because a lot of Jay's early albums had him on the front of the cover, but it seems that as he grew as a person and his taste grew, then his cover designs grew as well. Like you start seeing less of him on the cover. It was more about the concept as opposed to him as the artist. Then you get Outkast at the very bottom in the middle where you see obviously two sides of the same coin, Andre and Big Boy. And you get this American flag that's scaled back in black and white. Yeah, this almost feels like a kind of a very rock kind of cover, if you think about it. Like, Outkast, particularly this album, Stankonia, was inspired by a lot of like different types of music. And it was just, in my opinion, some would say that this was like their crossover album. Like, this is when more and more people really started listening to Outkast. And it's beautiful, right? One of my favorites. Then you got A$AP Rocky, Long Live A$AP, right? I've always liked a lot of his covers and his overall style. You look at this, I almost feel like you're tuning into like this old TV show that's black and white, kind of has some distortions going on. But it feels like a narrative that's about to be told through the form of like TV and broadcast, right? And obviously you got, Kanye West with his whole graduation using Takashi Murakami. And it's funny, a lot of his covers, which we'll cover shortly in Donda covers or Donda design, he used one of the world's greatest artists at the time, and even to this day, Takashi Murakami, to kind of talk about this bear persona that were on his first three albums, and this bear that's almost taking off and leaving that past behind to become something bigger than what he was. And some would say that this is the old Kanye, right? The one that they kind of enjoyed the most. But obviously, the albums after this particular album were definitely wildly different. Some of my more favorite ones, to be honest with you, but yeah, Kanye typically had a way of using album cover art in a very unique and creative way that didn't feel heavy-handed, and it was very, very contemporary and just very smart. Now let's get into, something that's not talked enough about the female MCs and some of their covers. You think about Cardi B, Missy Elliott, Nicki Minaj, Rhapsody, and obviously the Miss Education Lauryn Hill. These are all five different MCs, five different women, all communicating a visual language with their covers that, obviously matches their disposition in their music. Cardi B has this bigger than life, very, you know, broad, kind of like bold personality, and this cover kind of really brings that to life with the heavy black and white patterns and the big typography and the beautiful colors. Missy Elliott, phenomenal creative, like all her music and just her videos was just super creative. Like, so her cover is just kind of matches what she was doing at the time. You got Nicki Minaj with her Pink Friday. I almost feel like this doll kind of having like this radiant energy. You got the Miss Education Lauryn Hill, right? That was a phenomenal album. You got this etching of a person, of her face actually, in the desk, right? Which is kind of cool because it's a take on the Miss Education of the Negro. So it's kind of cool. Great, great, great album cover. Then you got Rhapsody, right? This beautiful, well-designed cover of a young lady almost being embodied by this sense of tapestry of beauty and this kind of halo effect of like coolness. Then you got some other female MCs. You got Raw Digger, you got Trina, you got Remy Ma, you got Tara Wack, you got Lakeely, 47, you got Young M.A., you got Megan Thee Stallion and MC Light. All these covers, more or less had to kind of tell a story of the type of music they were creating. A lot of times, you can just design her own cover. Lakeely 47, hey, it's a portrait of a person, but it's funny, we don't know how she looked, and I think that's kind of great because that's her persona. She always wear a mask, and it's pretty straightforward, but it's still very something creative and cool about that. Then you got Raw Digger using a portrait of Angela Davis. Then you got MC Light showing the sense of opulence, right? New York kind of backdrop with these two Porsche cars. These covers, more or less, definitely tell a quick story. They tell a story of their music, and it totally matches their personas. Now, let's get into pen and pixel. This style of design is, for most designers are not a fan of it. Even I, at the point, wasn't a big fan of it, but I understand the importance of this. Specifically that these guys went to a company called Pen and Pixels, the Master P's of the world, the Suave Houses, definitely the No Limits, the Cash Money. All these different guys went to this design house called Pen and Pixel that had a covers design because they wanted these larger than life covers that told like a very fantastical story of like opulence, being rich, just being just bigger than life. Had these really, what I call overly done with Photoshop covers. But nonetheless, what worked for these actual covers is that if you saw this cover in a music store, you actually know what you would get into. You know exactly who's the artist. So it broke through a lot of noise with noise. Now, the exact opposite of that would be the Donda covers. This is where we look at everything from like, Yeezus to Pusha T to Nicki Minaj and even like John Legend. Like their covers are meant to be designed to be more streamlined, more minimalistic, definitely much more, regal and definitely more creative and artistic with intent, right? I know, Kanye is and Virgil and a lot of the designers like Matt Williams and, Virgil and a couple other guys. The intent was to create these covers that felt timeless. It was, reduced the noise. You definitely didn't even see words on the cover, right? It was just a beautiful visual. And then you have the comic book style, where it's going to be Doomsday from MF Doom to Outkast to, Czar's face, or even like Outkast with Ghostface. But, and then you got Logic at the bottom right. So you got that's like another way of looking like album cover design. Now, these are my favorites, right? Nas, obviously, kind of, telling this story of a coming of age of a young man in Queensbridge. You got Kanye West, 808s and Heartbreaks. You got MF Doom and Madlib with Matt Villiani. You got Tierra Wax, I Love De La Soul. Obviously, Rhapsody has a dope cover. You got Enter the Woo. I mean, come on, 9MCs with the ghost face. It's beautiful. And then you got Gangstar with this whole daily operation. Now, in conclusion, design plus creativity made us more human, right? So it definitely made us much more in tune with who we are as a species. But, hip hop made us much more fly. And I'm leaving you with a quote, right? That Queen Latifah, one of the pioneers, early pioneers of hip hop, once said, to me, hip hop would never be right until female rappers have a stronger voice in it. I think we can take that quote and amend it and have it where, to me, hip hop would never be right until female rappers help design a stronger voice in it. So this is when we're talking about truly having those in hip hop be more or less, steer the ship and design a better version of it going forward. And, that's my spiel. Again, you can reach me here on Instagram. Twitter, I guess, is X now, so I don't care, but I still call it Twitter. Connect with me, and we'll talk soon.